Interpretation means, you want me to define it a little? Yeah. So interpretation means, did I spell it wrong? It's, and here's everybody in the world is watching this. This is embarrassing. It's very hard to spell. Is that okay now? Yeah, okay. I didn't get a PhD in comparative literature for nothing. No, the blackboard is inside my focal length when I turn around, so it's hard for me to spell. Yes, it's interpretation. The definition is creating a framework of understanding in which, in the present case, third-party intervention, third-party nonviolent intervention can be grasped. Let me put it that way. You have this wonderful verb in Dutch, begrijpen, which to understand means to grab a hold of and take in. Yeah. Because if you don't have that framework, you can see event after event after event go by, and even if the press told you what happened, which they won't do that in the first place, but even if they did, you wouldn't recognize it, you wouldn't acknowledge it as something important. It's like advertising. They know that in advertising, they have to hit you with an idea at least 3 times before you actually conceive the desire to buy happiness or freedom in the form of their product. Okay. The first time, it's just going to go by. Yeah. Yes? To build it. That's a very good question. What are the strategies that we could use or are trying to use to help people get this framework? The whole thing is so new that I don't know if we can generalize about it, but the way I've always thought, I want to say something. Oh, thank you, Zoe. The way I've always thought about it is we're trying to lay out the history, the theory, and the history. I guess those two will do actually. The history and the theory. What happened and why it happened. And so I always start from the basic framework of principles of nonviolence, and I say even in conflict there is a part of people that did not want to be in that conflict, but in the normal course of events, conflict is very polarizing, and that means it's me against you. The minute a third party is on the scene, it's no longer just me against you anymore. That breaks up the mental framework that the conflict is happening in, and you can systematically build on this. You can do it deliberately. So it's the theory and the history that we work on. And now, incidentally, back on the training piece for just a second, Matthias had a question last week, how do you do this training? I've always thought that we should think of training, that's Training, on 3 levels. There's region-specific, SPECI, which is things like language and culture, like, don't insult Muhammad when you're in an Islamic country, things like that low-grade morons should understand. But there's all kinds of things, like how to do business in a Japanese country is totally different from how you do it in the West. And I remember hearing about a training film that's being shown to oil workers going over to the Middle East. It turns out that in the West, the personal envelope is about 24 inches. In other words, when you go up to talk to somebody for ordinary purposes, you tend to stand about 24 inches away from them. But in the Middle East, it's about 16 inches. So here's this American businessman. He's had this long conversation with a sheikh, and he gets up to shake hands, and the sheikh moves into within his envelope, which is 16 inches. The American backs up to reestablish 24, and the sheikh moves in, and basically they're chasing each other around the table. So you have to know some things about how each culture works in order to operate in that culture. I don't want to sort of list out all the mistakes that the American military has made in the Middle East, but I'll leave that up to your imagination. So that's one thing. And then the next thing, underneath that, which could apply anywhere, are conflict resolution techniques. And this is a growth industry now. Every major town has a mediation center, and they can spell out for you certain practices that work and certain ones that don't work when you have a dispute. How to do it with a third party, how to do it without a third party. All this stuff is pretty well known. Now, within conflict resolution strategies, there are some that are specific to international work, and TPNI, one of them is, you're in there, one of the tasks that you're performing, when you're in intervention as a cross-border intervener, is witnessing and recording. So one of the most powerful tools that you have is your camera. But there are moments in every conflict where privacy is essential, and if you even hint that outsiders are going to know about what you're doing, they will either clam up, or what's worse, they will smash your camera and maybe smash you. So there's a specific subset of skills, and a friend of mine, Lizzie Brock, has written a little booklet on these that you learn within the conflict resolution arena. And then the deepest one of all is some kind of spiritual discipline, and that's the really hard part to spell. I mean, to talk about and promote publicly, because it's a very private matter. But as Thich Nhat Hanh said, you may be dedicated to nonviolence, but once you get into the conflict and it's happening, you're going to forget that you ever had nonviolence. You need something deeper. Basically what you need, if you remember back to our friend, the mother in Chile, who talked about her anger being converted into rage, being converted into work, which overcame fear, remember that wonderful dynamic, you need a mechanism that's built into your unconscious mind that does that automatically. So when anger and fear come up, they go through this wonderful conversion. It's called PAX 94, right? Okay. Any other questions then about third-party intervention? Yes, Jenna. Jenna's asking, how can we tell that it's a conflict that people will care about? Well, the crude way is to start with one that they care about already. There's a fair amount of attention on Palestine and almost nothing on Tibet. There's a fair amount of attention, and where else? We have sort of not thinking about just a war, but, well, I guess for a certain period of time, there was a fair amount of attention on the color revolutions in Eastern Europe. So whenever somebody got poisoned, that was reported in the paper. And when there was a big mob in Georgia or Uzbekistan, people were looking at it, but people are paying absolutely no attention to the women of Namibia. Very, very little to Nigeria. So I don't think at this point we have the capacity to focus attention. The only thing we can do is to go where it is already focused. And I'm not saying this is the only criterion that we would apply. I mean, if there's a place where we could save a lot of human lives and help a country stabilize, we're going to go there even if nobody's paying attention. But for it to have long-term significance, we have to get the attention out there. Now, having said that, what's different about the last 10 or 12 years is who needs the mass media anymore? We have alternative media now. For a couple, well, maybe for $1,000, $1,500, you could turn a field team member into a walking, real-time, streaming, YouTube, whatever it is, the next thing going on. So, they'll be in there, they'll have this little device clipped on them, and people back in the States will be watching it in the bar where they're drinking it. Well, that'll take a little while, but you know what I mean? There are ways that we're rebuilding a whole new way of communicating, which is going to, I hope, very soon, render the mainstream media irrelevant. I know we're within earshot of Northgate Hall, but I've said it and I'm glad. Yes, Harvey? I think the answer to that question is no. And the reason is partly because I don't think people are aware enough of how important awareness is. Pardon me being kind of cute here, but people are so fixated on the physicality of the situation, which God knows is compelling, that they forget that it's a mental situation also. And if you change minds, you would change behaviors very rapidly and very efficiently. So that's one problem. And another is, as I say, once you get into this work, you get so caught in what you're able to do for people that, I guess it's also a third thing that makes it difficult is that I remember talking to Lizzie Brock, the woman who did the booklet that I mentioned in this connection, coming back from Colombia, one of the most brutal conflict areas in the world today. And she was okay as long as she was thinking in Spanish. But after being back in the States for a couple of days, she started thinking in English again, and then she started hearing her thoughts, if you will, and she was no longer used to it, and she was hearing what she was actually saying, and she was traumatized by that. It was very, very difficult. So one of the things that we've learned is when you bring a team back or a person back from a team, unlike the American military, which says bye-bye, you have to take care of that person. They need to readjust emotionally, as well as getting $600 or something to get them back into the culture. So there's really a new area where we're learning a lot. But the answer, unfortunately, is no. There's no single organization dedicated to doing the interpretation, except it might be Meta. Like that's one of the reasons I'm so keen on doing this work. Okay, there's one other. Okay, all right. Let's move on. And as usual, the stuff is cumulative. We can come back to it. And as you figured out by now, it does not take much to get me talking about the TPNI. So anytime things are getting slow, just say TPNI, and off we will go. So we want to move on to a rather different area of operations, which the term for which is restorative justice. And you have some really good readings selected for you in the reader. I think if I had to define it in one snappy phrase, I would pick one that's already been used in a different connection, and that phrase would be justice as if people mattered. Because retributive justice is really justice as if people don't matter, abstractions do. Maybe if we're talking about the concept of justice for just a minute or two, we take it for granted that we all know what justice is, and you get into a conversation about it, you discover, even in your own culture, you discover that's not so easy. There's different definitions of justice, distributive, and so on. People make a living talking about this. They're called ethicists, and I'm not going to try to encroach on their field. But you have an even greater shock when you go over to different cultures. And I remember hearing a talk on a certain region, a Himalayan region that's on the border between Tibet and India, a talk by Helena Norbert Hodge, and the name of this region is Ladakh. And I don't know why she had originally gone there, but she spent quite a bit of time there. And in the period I'm talking about, the late 80s, she was kind of making this her shtick. She was going around talking everywhere about what she was discovering there, because it was not a subsistence culture, even though it was way up there on the Himalayan plateau. These people had They had enough to survive on plus excess, so they did beautiful art and things like that. But they lived in smallish villages, and she noticed something very interesting while she was there, which is pertinent to us. She was with a villager who lived in this little hut, and a sack of rice, a big sack of rice, was stolen from him and his family. The village being small, everybody knew who stole the rice, unlike the person who stole my bicycle last week. We have no idea. Yes, thank you. I thought I deserved a little sympathy for that. We had no way of finding out who that person was. But in a village, everybody knows who stole the rice, so she thought that the victim would just march up to this person's house and say, that's my bag of rice. And it was a bag of rice, a big sack. It's important. You live in the Himalayas. You got to keep your family alive. It's not a joke. But the person didn't do it, and he didn't do it. And finally, she said to him, why don't you confront him and get your rice back? He said, because I have to live in this village. In other words, the relationship is more important than the object. So if they could stay bonded as friends, as members of the community, that is a more important value, even a more important survival value than recovering this one sack of rice. Okay? So Helena's way of putting that was they care more about relationships and community. They care more about community than they do about justice. But I would say they have a different concept of justice. So I would look at it. And so now, of course, you're dying to hear what my definition of justice is, and I will not frustrate you any further. The definition which I just came up with in the Free Speech Cafe right after you left, Zoe, is justice is an agreed upon set of norms that move the individual and society toward, quote, loving community, unquote, towards a more perfect union where peace spontaneously is maintained within that framework, in that society, whatever it is. So justice is whatever gets you there. Now, if this is a definition of justice, then to say retributive justice is like saying martial law. As you know, when martial law was declared in the Punjab in the 1920s, Gandhi said they have just declared martial law, which means no law at all. The point of law is to create a stability which would not require the use of force or threat. So the use of force kind of cancels, rules out the prevailing law. So if you look at page 141 of your reader, which I was clever enough to bring with me today, the basic assumption about the relationship between criminal justice and punishment needs to be re-examined. This is the right-hand side of that page. Punishment is the deliberate infliction of suffering. It is legal violence. So this book claims that punishment is counterproductive and needs fresh examination and so forth. So in a non-violent order, there is basically, I'm saying basically it's a slight hedge, it's going to be a slight margin for this, but very, very slight. There is basically no place for punishment. You remember the famous illustration of that in the very early days in one of the two settlements in which he lived in South Africa. Some of the teenagers, the young adults, misbehaved. I mean, probably they smoked a cigarette or something like that, and he found out about it. He felt he had to do something about it, but he came up against a dilemma because he felt in an ashram punishment is not appropriate. So he figured out that the thing to do was to take the suffering on himself, and he fasted. And when he did that, it had an amazing eye-opening effect on the teenagers. So we've discussed that example and some others. So it's restorative justice is justice as if people mattered and their community matters. And there's a very neat, catchy way that one of the restorative justice workers in this country, operates in the South, has put it. In retributive justice, when somebody has committed an infraction against the community, you say, hey, get out of here. And you create an area where that person lives sequestered from the rest of society. Whereas in restorative justice, what you do is you say to that person, hey, get back in here. And you create a framework for them to do that. Yeah, Zoe? Well, this is really a good question. Hard question, but a good question. Zoe is saying, can a culture or even a group become so dehumanized that your willingness to suffer and perhaps your suffering would not open their eyes in the way that I just described? I'm going to give you a good academic answer to that, which is yes and no. What I mean is this. You can definitely dehumanize people to the point where they would not show any reaction. But I believe, and just a belief, hang on one second, Ahmed. I believe that it is impossible for the other person not to be touched at all, and I would invoke the mirror neuron phenomenon for that, even against their will. Some of them neurons are going to be firing off. So what we try to do is not let things deteriorate so badly, not be in a position where we have to intervene at such a late stage that the person will not be consciously aware of what's going on inside of them. But I mean, personally, I do not believe that a person can be so closed off that nothing would happen. If they were, they would, they'd get to be the president. No. If they were, it would be like, they'd be catatonic or something like that. Ahmed? Okay, this is a very fair question because I've been using the term a lot, and it would be probably a good idea to know what it means. And the reason that it's not a snap to define is that it's a funny thing and it cuts both ways. I guess the best way to approach it would be to say that dehumanization means a breaking of contact with human community. The reason I want to put it that way is you cannot lose sight of the humanity of another without losing sight of your own. This is one of the big discoveries that's happened in nonviolence. I mean, you can go around saying, we are important and you're nothing, but you're really denying your own importance as a person when you do that. And when I say the humanity of another, I guess a simple way to look at that is that they can suffer and their suffering matters. Now, it's kind of funny that in the realm of animal rights, which we were scheduled to move on to at some point, and we may, one of the arguments that animal rights people make is it's not whether animals can think or whether they have rights, but whether they can feel. If they can feel, we do not want to inflict pain on them. So, but I'm saying a human, I guess I'm not saying it's limited to Homo sapiens sapiens, but you remember, your question is maybe kind of grope around for an answer, Ahmed, and that's good. I hope you're enjoying my discomfort up here. The Buddha said, and Jain thinkers have also said, even the meanest creature wants to live. Even the meanest creature avoids pain. Therefore, do not kill or cause to kill. That's one of, I think, the most profound aphorisms of the Buddha. So when you have another person at your mercy and you inflict suffering on them and you think you're enjoying it, you're denying their humanity. Maybe not on the intellectual level. Maybe if you took a survey afterwards and the questionnaire said, do you think that your prisoner suffered? And you said, oh yeah, haha, suffered a lot, it was great. But really, you'd be cut off from it. You would not know what you were saying. Absolutely not. No, suffering here does not only refer to physical violence. In fact, in the studies of media violence and how it hurts people, they discovered a couple of interesting things. One is that it makes absolutely no difference whether you think the violence you're watching is real or it's just an image. In other words, whether it's quote news or quote entertainment makes virtually no difference, even in adults. You see a scene of violence, it's going to damage you. What does make a difference is what is being violated. If it's a relationship between strangers where there hardly is any relationship, the hurt is limited, it's minimal. But if it's a close relationship that's being violated, say intra-family relationship being torn apart, the pain that you go through is much greater. And that denial of community on that very deep level is a form of dehumanization. And what are the numbers now? I mean, when I was last reading about this, by the time you were 18 years old, in this country or any imitator thereof, you had been exposed to 200,000 murders on television.